On a June morning in 2020, two banks in the Philippines were asked a simple question. Do you hold 1.9 billion euros belonging to Germany's most celebrated technology company? Their answer detonated one of the largest frauds in European history. The documents were forgeries. The accounts were fiction. The money had never existed. Within a week, the company was insolvent, its CEO was in handcuffs, and its chief operating officer had vanished off the face of the earth on a private jet. This is the story of Wirecard, the fintech miracle that Germany defended until the very moment it evaporated. Wirecard began about as far from respectability as a payments company can, processing credit cards for gambling and adult websites in the early 2000s, the business nobody else wanted. A young Austrian consultant named Markus Braun took over, injected his own money, and began transforming the company's image. Braun dressed like a tech prophet, black turtleneck and rimless glasses, and spoke in the language of digital revolutions. Germany, a country famously anxious about its digital future, wanted desperately to believe it had produced a champion. In Wirecard, it thought it had one. The company grew at a pace that should have raised questions, swallowing obscure payment processors across Asia and reporting profits that never stumbled. In September 2018, Wirecard entered the DAX, the index of Germany's 30 most important corporations, pushing out Commerzbank, a 108-year-old institution. At its peak, Wirecard was worth more than Deutsche Bank. Beside Braun stood his opposite. Jan Marsalek, the chief operating officer, ran the company's sprawling Asian operations. Where Braun performed for cameras, Marsalek lived in the shadows, a man without a public profile who flew constantly, kept impossible hours, and cultivated friendships that had nothing to do with payments. Colleagues later described him as charming, tireless, and completely unreadable. The heart of the supposed business was something called third-party acquiring. In countries where Wirecard lacked licenses, partner companies allegedly processed billions in payments on its behalf, and the profits from that invisible empire flowed into accounts held in trust. Most of Wirecard's earnings existed in exactly this form, which is to say, on paper, somewhere far away. For years, journalists at the Financial Times pulled at exactly this thread. A reporter named Dan McCrum began publishing investigations suggesting Wirecard's Asian empire was a hall of mirrors, propped up by forged contracts, backdated agreements, and round-tripped money. Wirecard's response was to attack. And here is where the story turns from corporate fraud into national embarrassment. Germany's financial regulator did not investigate Wirecard. It investigated the journalists. It filed criminal complaints against the reporters and, in an unprecedented move, banned short selling of Wirecard shares, effectively declaring the company a protected species. Hedge funds who bet against Wirecard were painted as foreign raiders. Whistleblowers inside the company's Singapore office, who had flagged forgery as early as 2018, watched their warnings disappear into internal reviews run by the very executives they were warning about. Meanwhile, Marsalek's other life kept gleaming into view for anyone who looked. He held court in a Munich villa that happened to sit across the street from the Russian consulate. He boasted to acquaintances about mercenary projects in Libya, and once showed dinner guests what he claimed was the classified formula for a Russian military nerve agent. None of this seemed like normal behavior for a payments executive. Nobody who mattered asked why. By 2019, the pressure had grown too loud to ignore, and Wirecard commissioned a special audit to clear its name once and for all. The auditors spent months asking for basic evidence that the third-party business existed. Bank statements, contracts, customer names. What they received were screenshots, spreadsheets, and excuses. The audit ended without the auditors being able to confirm that the heart of the company was real. Even then, the stock survived. Braun promised transparency. A year earlier, one of the world's most powerful technology investors had handed Wirecard nearly $1 billion in a deal that read, "to the market," as the ultimate seal of approval. Analysts at major banks kept their buy ratings almost to the end. Germany still wanted its champion. It is worth pausing on how many alarms had to be ignored for this to work. Journalists reported forged contracts, ignored. Whistleblowers delivered documents, buried. A special audit could not find the business, excused. Short sellers were fined and threatened for noticing. Fraud on this scale is never one man's lie. It is a lie that an entire system decides it prefers to the truth. The end came down to a single signature. In June 2020, the company's longtime auditor, Ernst & Young, refused to sign the annual accounts without confirming the money at the center of everything. 1.9 billion euros supposedly parked in escrow accounts at 2 Philippine banks, the accumulated profits of the invisible empire. Confirmation letters had been provided, photographs of documents, even a video call with a man presented as a trustee, so the auditors went around the paper and asked the banks directly. Both banks gave the same answer. The documents were crude forgeries. The accounts did not exist. One bank pointed out that the branch named in the paperwork could not possibly hold such a sum. The money, a quarter of the company's entire balance sheet, was fiction. What followed was the fastest collapse in German corporate history. Braun resigned and was arrested within days. And Jan Marsalek, the man who ran the empire that didn't exist, told colleagues he was flying to Manila to track down the missing billions and clear everything up. He never went to Manila. Philippine immigration records showing his arrival were forged, one last act of paperwork magic. Instead, investigators reconstructed a different journey, a small airfield outside Vienna, a chartered turboprop, a night flight east to Minsk. From there, Jan Marsalek dissolved into the fog. A week after the bank's letters, Wirecard filed for insolvency, the first DAX company ever to do so. Tens of billions of euros in shareholder value were gone. Pension funds, index funds, and ordinary Germans who had trusted the national champion were left holding confetti. The reckoning has been long and ugly. Braun has sat in custody for years, on trial in Munich, insisting he too was deceived. The head of Germany's financial regulator resigned, and a parliamentary inquiry spent a year cataloging every institution that had looked away, from auditors to ministries. The accounting firm that signed a decade of Wirecard's books was barred from taking on major new listed clients. And Dan McCrum, the journalist Germany tried to prosecute, watched prosecutors confirm nearly everything he had written. But the strangest chapter belongs to Marsalek. After his disappearance, investigators discovered that Wirecard's shadow COO had been living a second life all along, entangled with intelligence operatives, obsessed with mercenaries and geopolitics, in possession of documents he should never have seen. Western agencies now believe he had been working with Russian intelligence for years, and that after Minsk he made his way to Moscow, where he has reportedly lived under false identities, running espionage networks whose operatives have since been convicted in Britain. Think about what that means. The man who controlled the fictional half of a DAX company's balance sheet may not have been a businessman committing fraud, but something stranger. An intelligence asset wearing a fintech company as a costume, with 1.9 billion missing euros as the price of the show. Somewhere in Moscow, if the reports are right, the only man who knows the whole truth reads about the trial of his old boss. The money, of course, cannot be recovered because most of it was never there to begin with. Wirecard did not lose 1.9 billion euros. It lost the pretense that the money had ever existed, and the pretense was the company. Follow where money dies for the fortunes history tried to bury.